All right, so today this lesson is going to be sounding a little more like a world history lesson than a European history lesson, but this is hitting our interactions theme, which is interactions of Europe and the world. So today we're going to be talking about how did decolonization and the Cold War impact the world. And so this is going to be a two-parter. So the first question is, how did World War II impact colonial policy? So, like I said, for some of you guys, this is going to sound like a little bit of a review from world history. Some of these names and people and events might seem familiar to you. For some of you, obviously, this is new, and you'll be reminded of this lesson when you hit upon this later in world history. But during World War II, the war forced a lot of the military forces that were stationed in the various different colonies around the world, the various different European colonies around the world. It forced many of those forces back to Europe. And what happens kind of after the war is it's really hard for the Europeans to afford their empires. You know, their economies are destroyed after World War I and then World War II. And it's expensive to run a colony. It's profitable to run a colony, but it's also expensive to run a colony. And this is one of the biggest things, if you're going to be working so hard to fight tyranny in Europe, to try to get rid of someone like a Hitler, then how can you justify being a tyrant yourself to your colonized people? Because for many, many years, and we'll see this more when we talk about this in world history, the British were not the best mothers, I guess you could say, to their, to their colonies. So they weren't always the kindest to the Indians. They did a lot of things that caused a lot of people to die in India. There was a lot of, mismanagement of the Indian people. So you kind of can't continue to be a tyrant over other people, while you're trying to fight that type of tyranny in Europe itself. Another issue is a lot of the colonial soldiers actually fight in the war. In World War I, for instance, it's almost 1 million soldiers from India that fight in World War I. And there was many, many soldiers that fought in World War II as well. And so when these colonial soldiers go and they fight in this war, for them, the reason why they decided to go and fight for a war in Europe was they wanted self-determination back at home. They wanted more power over their countries back at home. A lot of these colonists that did go and fight, the upper levels of the societies in the colonies were being educated in Europe. And a lot of these people are going to be the ones that are going to begin these nationalistic movements. So on this picture here, I have Gandhi and I have Nehru. And both of these men were educated in London. And, so they kind of saw what type of governments they had in London and in Britain, and they wanted those types of governments for themselves at home. In addition, the U.S. opposed Europe having empires, especially after World War II. And our civil rights movement, in a lot of ways, echoed the values of the colonists. Dr. Martin Luther King was very, very influenced by Gandhi and his, methods of fighting for freedom for the Indian people. So in 1947, Britain is going to leave India. The result of that is that India is going to break into 3 countries. Well, at this point, it was 2 countries, India and Pakistan. But Pakistan back then, when it was first got its independence, consisted of what today is Pakistan and then what today also is Bangladesh, which was referred to as East Pakistan. But now they're 2 separate countries. In a lot of the African nations, the political organizations that were formed by Africans before the war are going to become the first political parties after the war, and they're again going to be the ones that are really going to push for an independence for their countries. So one of the first countries to gain their independence was a colony that was referred to as the Gold Coast. Today it's called Ghana. It was a British colony, but a man by the name of Kwame Nkrumah, you could see how his name is spelled down there, he forms the Convention People's Party and helps to gain independence for the country of Ghana. In the late 1940s, Jomo Kenyatta forms the Kenyan African National Union. So Kenya was also a British colony, and he is going to lead a non-violent movement led by mostly Western educated intellectuals. Some of these people were merchants, some of them were urban professionals, others were members of labor unions, and they're going to kind of help fight for independence for their countries as well. Other areas, withdrawal occurred because there was pressure from armed militants. So also within Kenya, there was a group that was referred to as the Mau Maus, and the Mau Maus, and that's spelled M-A-U, and And the Mau Maus were a group that were willing to use terroristic activities, and they were able to put pressure on the British, and the British are going to pull out of Kenya in 1959. Now, in places like Egypt, for instance, we'll talk a little bit about that. We talked a little bit about Egypt in class in talking about the nationalization of the Suez Canal and how that affected created a war in the Middle East and conflict between the U.S. and the Soviets. But Egypt was a protectorate of Great Britain since the 1880s, and if you remember, the main draw for Egypt, of course, is the Suez Canal. So in 1918, a political party was formed. It was called the WAFT. Hold on, I thought my pen was still working. It was called the WAFT Party. And this, again, was in Egypt. And their goal was to promote Egyptian independence. Egypt gained its independence in 1922, but technically it's still under British control. And so basically a monarchy was set up that really kind of ruled in the British favor. They ruled until 1953, when they were overthrown by an army coup, and oh my Lord, what's his name? Oh my God, we went over him in class, and he's not in my notes, and I forgot his name for a second. Who was the leader of Egypt? Sorry, Abdel Nasser. Oh my Lord, I'm so sorry. Lost my brain for a second. Please forgive me. But Abdel Nasser comes to power. He seizes power in 1952-53 in an army coup. And then he's the one who nationalizes the Suez Canal, if you remember what we were talking about in class. Now, in North Africa was an area that was primarily French controlled, like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia were all French colonies. But the French really, after World War II, were not strong enough to maintain control over their empire, because especially with the occupation by Germany and all the devastation that they faced. So in 1956, they give Morocco and Tunisia their independence. Now, Algeria was a little bit of a different story. Algeria, who's in North Africa, about 2 million French settlers lived in Algeria. They had political representation back in the French legislature. Algeria would be what we consider a settler colony, in that you have this large number of French permanently settling there in Algeria. And they really wanted to maintain control within Algeria, especially because Algeria was seen to have like a special significance during the war, because de Gaulle and the French resistance was kind of based in Algeria. But the Algerian nationalists formed something called the National Liberation Front, and they initiated a guerrilla warfare against French rule in Algeria, starting in 1952. By 1962, de Gaulle grants Algeria full independence, and this actually created a great deal of strife within France itself, because a lot of the French militant nationalists really felt that holding on to Algeria was a point of national pride. They did not want to let Algeria go. They were very upset at de Gaulle's decision. It almost sent the country into another revolution and upturned the whole government. That's how strongly some people felt about maintaining control over Algeria. But like I said, in 1962, de Gaulle does grant the Algerians their independence. So we also see other areas begin to become moving more towards independence. However, a country like South Africa was a little bit of a different situation. It was another one of these settler colonies. There were large numbers of British and then formerly Dutch settlers living there. But in 1912, the South African National Congress was formed, the ANC, the African National Congress, and it was formed by intellectuals within the South African community who wanted their full independence from Britain and wanted full equality. Because if you remember anything about South Africa is the country that had apartheid, where the races were legally kept separate and the whites had all the privileges, even though they were the minority, and the blacks, who were the majority, had no rights. So in the 1950s, South African whites were really strengthening these apartheid laws to separate the races. And there was a lot of demonstrations against these policies, which was met with a great deal of police repression. Essentially, South Africa almost becomes a police state in order to maintain these apartheid laws. In 1952, Nelson Mandela, who was a member of the leader of the ANC, was arrested and the ANC began to call for armed resistance. Mandela doesn't gain his freedom for another 30 years. He stays in prison. He eventually goes on to become the first black president of South Africa. So I can kind of see, though, how control over the colonies is definitely beginning to lessen as time is going on. After World War II, it's becoming harder, like I said, for these European countries to maintain their empires. But that takes us to the second question. How did French decolonization become tied to the Cold War? So this is going to be talking a little bit about Vietnam. So Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were all used to be referred to as Indochina, and Indochina was mostly a French colony. In 1930, this man here, Ho Chi Minh, is going to organize a movement against French colonial rule. It's going to be called the Indochinese Communist Party. In September of 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares independence for Vietnam under an organization called, the Viet Minh, which were nationalists but dominated by communists. They opposed the claim that the French should have control over the country. I mean, for the Vietnamese, they called World War II the Japanese War, and then this war that they're going to be fighting to try to gain independence, they called that the French War, and then eventually they're going to call Vietnam, what we call the Vietnam War, they're going to call the American War. But so the French decided to create their own pro-French government, like kind of sort of give them their independence, but under a pro-French government. And the U.S. at this point, we were actually urging the French to work with the Viet Minh because we had this anti-colonial stance in the world. So in 1947, war breaks out between the Viet Minh and the French. So in 1948, the French, established a pro-French Vietnamese government under the control of a man named Bao Dai. Now, for those of you who are in AP US, Mr. Simone would probably give you a heck of a lot more information with this. But this government that was formed under Bao Dai was a loose union with France. They really didn't have their independence at all. Now, so throughout all of this, Ho Chi Minh is still kind of fighting for full freedom for the Vietnamese. And I just wanted to show you quickly. Remember I told you how in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh is kind of preserved like Lenin. I couldn't take any pictures of the tomb inside, but that's the tomb of Ho Chi Minh outside, and there's Liam hanging out. And so this is kind of the grounds in Hanoi around where the shrine is to Ho Chi Minh. And there you can see, there's me doing my pose. So what happens in Vietnam is in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek is defeated and China becomes communist. The People's Republic of China is declared. Now, this is significant because at this point now, we saw this French colonial war as integral to the Cold War. Where before that, we were kind of supportive of the Viet Minh, and we were like, just let the Vietnamese have their independence. Now, China's communist. There's fear that Vietnam might go communist. So now this kind of pulls it all into the Cold War. So in 1950, the U.S. recognizes the Bao Dai government, and the USSR and China recognizes Ho Chi Minh's government. So we begin to send aid to the French war effort. In 1954, there's a conference at Geneva to settle this whole conflict. The French army had fallen by this point. A new premier was elected in France who was anti-war. The decision was to divide the country of Vietnam, kind of how Korea was divided after World War II, into a North and a South in 1956. And it was supposed to be reunified through elections. The North was controlled by the Viet Minh. The South were controlled by the French. But by 1955, French troops begin to withdraw. And then there begins to be a fight for power in South Vietnam. So by this point, the person who was in control of South Vietnam was a man by the name of, and I don't know how to pronounce this, I will be honest with you, Ngo Diem, I believe, and we supported him. He was a non-communist nationalist, and he didn't really work with the French. But since the U.S. had supported the French, any government that kind of was tied to that was looked at suspiciously by the South Vietnamese. So in 1956, we began training troops, government officials. We began paying salaries and supplying military equipment, because we were taking this very anti-communist campaign. We refused to hold elections for reunification because it was a fear that they would actually vote to go with Ho Chi Minh, who was a pretty popular character within the country. So those who began to resist those people who had resisted the French in the past began to be attacked, and there began to be a lot of political repression under his power. And so as a result, his main support was actually from North Vietnamese who had left North Vietnam, emigrated south because they didn't want to be under Ho Chi Minh's communist government. They were given the best jobs, they were given the best positions, and the people were very resentful of them. By 1960, there began to be a large amount of internal resistance to Deng's policies. Something called the National Liberation Front was founded in Vietnam. Their goal was to overthrow Deng, unify the country, reform the economy, and get rid of the Americans. The military, the military side of this was the Viet Cong. That's V-I-E-T. I don't know why my pen's not working too well. The Viet Cong, they were aided by the North, and they began using terrorist tactics against Diem's government, and we start to see an informal government being imposed by the Viet Cong within the countryside, because they actually were pretty well-liked in the countryside. So that takes us to this question: how the U.S. really get involved in Vietnam? So President Eisenhower and Kennedy supported Diem, but they wanted him to reform the government. But he wasn't really. He was becoming more and more repressive. So in November 1st of 1963, Diem was overthrown and was murdered in an army coup. And we were involved in the plot because we wanted to have a government in Vietnam that could gain popular support. So after that, this person, he is going to govern South Vietnam from 1966 until 1975. From 1963 on, our involvement in Vietnam, military involvement, continually expanded. By 1969, under Nixon, we began what was known as Vietnamization and a gradual withdrawal from Vietnam. Peace negotiations began in Paris in 1968. But we don't see a real ceasefire until 1973. And once that ceasefire was established, there was all sorts of violations on both sides. In 1975, it was decided that the U.S. needed to evacuate South Vietnam because Saigon was attacked by the North, and on April 30th, 1975, Saigon falls. So what happens during all of this while we were focusing so much of our attention on the conflict in Vietnam? We were diverting our attention from Europe. Our prestige suffered because this was the only war that we were seen to ever have lost. Our commitment to Western Europe was questioned. The wisdom of the U.S. was questioned because we were seen as being very ambitious and greedy and cruel, because there were a lot of atrocities committed against the Vietnamese people and a lot of atrocities committed against our troops in Vietnam. I want to show you some of the pictures when I was there in Vietnam. So the South Vietnamese would build these huge complexes of tunnels to hide from the from the South Vietnamese troops and from American troops, and they would have all complexes underneath there where they would kind of have places to live, hospitals, all these types of things kind of underground. And this, you could see one of the hatches going into one of these underground tunnels. So this is an area that used to be a minefield. Here you can see this is like one of the lookouts. There I am. But you could see supplies being parachuted in to the French troops. There's Nixon with the leader of South Vietnam. This is showing some of the atrocities that were committed against the South Vietnamese. This was the presidential palace for South Vietnam. So you can see it's the gates to it. And then when Saigon fell in 1975, there's the troops, the South Vietnamese troops, tanks coming in to the palace. And there you could see when the area fell. This is me and my sister and a couple of people went on a trip with. This was in what's called the Chu tunnels. This is actually an American tank. And this is this whole tunnel complex that was below the ground where the South Vietnamese would, where the Viet Cong would hide out from the U.S. And you could see, like, when they covered it, that's what it looked like. And you could see this was not made for Americans, because I can't even get myself down in there. Not made for my wide American hips, basically. But you could see that's one of these hatches. And this is inside the tunnel itself. And you could see how small some of the I had to completely crouch down, and they've actually enlarged the tunnels as now that they actually let, like, kind of tourists come in and explore the area. This is a famous photograph of an American soldier about to go down into one of these tunnels to try to kind of scope out some of the Viet Cong. And you could see just how complex some of this tunnel network would have been. So this is a monk burning himself in protest against what was going on in Vietnam. This is a picture of the evacuation. So evacuating U.S. officials, personnel, and people who were loyal, South Vietnamese who were kind of loyal to the U.S. who were trying to get out. This was mistakenly supposed to be everyone always thought this picture was of the U.S. Embassy, but it's actually not the U.S. Embassy. It was the CIA building. But just to give you a little bit of perspective, this is what it looks like today, that building. And this is it in kind of like context. You can kind of see there's the building today. But this is the rest of Saigon today. It's much more built up. So that takes us to this question, which we're going to talk about in the next video. So I'll stop here for now.